I'm Wayne Carey, and this is The Truth Hurts. Well, welcome to The Truth Hurts, and it pleases me with our first guest, Tony, and the reason for that is because this is the biggest topic in AFL football at the moment.
Well, in sports, Wayne.
In sport, and it is just, and it seems it's just getting worse and worse and worse, and there's no man that is educated more than the man that we're about to speak to, and I'm talking about Peter Jess, who is a AFL player advocate. He's also got a law degree. He's also, I think you've said to me before, Peter, a struggling local accountant. All of those different things. You wear a lot of different hats, but out of all the people that I've spoken to in regards to concussion, and I have read a lot about it in recent times, and there is no one better read than what you are on this topic, and that's why I think you're a great first guest for The Truth Hurts this year. And tell me, where do you think it all sits over the summer, Tony? The AFL signed a deal with a mouthguard company, which talks about shock. Peter, what do you think of the decision they've made?
Well, look, the whole paradigm about concussion should be, how do we prevent it? And by giving somebody a mouthguard to say, well, we're going to measure the size of the hit, defeats the purpose of prevention, because what it means is that you think that concussion becomes an automatic byproduct of you playing the sport, which is, in my view, dumb. I mean, we know that the University of Cincinnati reduced the overall rate of concussion by I think over a 10-year period, it was reduced at between 70 to 80%. Now, that should be our target because it is known. We know what the 9 factors were to reduce that. What we are locked in is this paradigm of a science and medicine that's failed.
But the AFL, they're not saying that this is an aid to tell you whether a player has concussion or not. It's simply to say that a player has received a knock with a certain amount of force. Yep. So that technically it's about the technology to give them information down the track. Is that where it should be?
Well, let's just look at this. We have 100 players who are suing, the AFL.
Which you're leading that?
Well, not really, but I've certainly had a lot to do with it. There are a large number of my players who are in that.
Yep.
But how many of the 100?
I'd say 30, maybe 40.
And who's the leading legal counsel on this?
I'm not sure who the final barristers are, because I'm not involved with anything to do with Margalit lawyers.
Gotcha.
For a whole range of reasons. But
is that number growing?
Well, look,
and is it going to grow? I mean, we've seen, young Brayshaw, who was actually retired from the game. I mean, it's just signed a massive deal, 5-year deal, and receives a knock, and now his career is over. Yep. Is it just going to go on and on and on?
Well, my view is this. I think that the class action really is a diversion from the truth. The truth is this, is that we have a game that is a concussion factory. It just doesn't stop week in, week out. Now, I've been involved in the sport for over 40 years. And, one of the things that I first noticed was 20-odd years ago when Macquarie, Professor Paul Macquarie, who then headed up the AFL, came in and he set up a group called the Concussion in Sports Group. Now, this then was, the aggregation of all the peak bodies throughout the world in a, collision-based sport forum. And they devolved certain, return-to-play protocols. One of them, the initial return-to-play protocol, was that you could return safely to sport after 6 days of a clinical, concussion. Now, that flew in the face of what was happening in the UK, where it was a 21-day stand down and a return to play in 28 days. So he basically then reset worldwide for 20 years the sports concussion agenda. Now, my view is none of which was ever supported by science and medicine. One of the things that I unfortunately happened to me was that I was knocked off my motor scooter. So I was diagnosed then as an incomplete paraplegic. So I was unconscious for about 10 to 15 minutes. I fractured 3 vertebrae in my neck, 4 in my back, 9 broken ribs and a punctured lung and a fractured jaw.
Was this with a car?
No, this was a motorbike.
Not in terms of with a car?
A car went through a stop sign and ignored my pleas to stop. So as a sort of consequence of that, I no longer ride a motorbike. I've now bought a Sherman tank and I think I'm a little bit safer.
Are there any ill effects that are ongoing from that?
Yeah. So what I did, I went through all of the traditional medicines, that said that I would be better within 4 to 6 weeks, that all of my symptoms would, resolve and I would live a normal life, right? So as things devolved, I found that I lost my balance. So I'd be walking along the street and then suddenly I'd lose my balance. My eyes became light sensitive. I developed tinnitus and eventually went deaf in my right ear. So I had migraines, a whole range of issues. So when guys come to see me who have had head traumas, it's a lived experience for me. So I actually know what they're going through and we can relate. And they then tell me, well, this is the first time that somebody's been able to explain to them in layman's terms what they're actually going through, and principally it manifests itself firstly as, behavioural issues. So, I had a whole range of issues with anger management, excitability where you increase your risk-taking and you actually develop a situation because your frontal lobe is damaged, you actually know that some of the things that you are doing are wrong, but you actually physically and mentally can't stop yourself from doing it. And that appears to be a common trait in guys who have had multiple, concussions. So I get it. And then what I then did, because all of the typical medical and science books said that you're unlikely to, be able to mitigate what had transpired to me. So I then developed my own neuroplasticity research, and it took a 10-year period where I was able to rewire my brain so I could still function at a rate, which enabled me then to go on and do a whole range of postgraduate things and study neuroscience. I travelled the world, met the world's leading scientists, and soon discovered that the protocols that were developed by the Concussion in Sports group and Professor Paul McCrory simply didn't match the clinical outcomes. So that meant if I could prove up, clinically that their science and medicine was wrong, we'd have to restate the whole, textbooks. Yep. So I then used to meet Paul McCrory and I would say to him is that, well, this is a clinical outcome that I'm seeing, not only from me but from other people, and your science and medicine said that it doesn't happen. So either I'm right and you're wrong, and if I'm right, then we're in a lot of trouble because you've misled thousands, if not millions of people into believing that there is no long-term damage, there's no structural damage from repetitive collisions.
Peter, sorry, can I interject? In terms of the scooter accident itself, yes. I'm assuming you wore a helmet?
I did.
And was there direct trauma to the head, like whether it be on the ground, to the car, whiplash?
No. Whiplash is a separate situation, right, which what we did when we were doing the scanning of the players, we found that there was a collateral disease that they were suffering from, which was called occipital neuralgia, which was a shearing of the nerve ends at the base of the neck. And that presented with constant headaches, migraines, which was a totally separate disease from the concussions.
How long after a player's career can they start to get effects? I mean, like you said, the science is continuing and every day, every week now, and we're hearing more and more about it because of obviously the seriousness of it. But how long can it stay, I guess, stagnant? before you start to get, say, the headaches or the acting out or those things? Can it remain stagnant for a while before that starts to occur, or is it something that just accumulates over time?
Well, what happens is we know now from the research that the impact on players is dose related. So with the research we did both in the elite and the sub-elite, we found unsurprisingly the damage at the Weekend Warrior was exactly the same as the guys who played in the AFL. So for me that was a major concern, because what we then discovered, the principal manifestation, as I said, first instant from guys who had repetitive traumas was behavioural issues, which then had a direct impact on the families, and they are the forgotten people in this. It's so distressing to see how the wives and families are left without any support systems, without any way that they can then get some knowledge of what is happening to their partners, and it's frightening.
So is there a test right now at a hospital, because that you can go into and say, well, you know what, I'm having these effects. I'm getting the headaches, or my behaviour is being a little bit more erratic. Is there something you can go in and they can definitively say you have that going on?
Well, look, what I found is the most specific scan is called a MEG scan. Now, what I did, I was a guinea pig for the AFL in their longitudinal study of players. So I went and did all the tests that they did, or that they were telling the players to do. So I did, the fMRI, I did the PET scan, I did the neurological test, and at the end of it, the Professor Chris Rowe came out and said, well, we've done all the tests and it appears as that you're normal. And I said, well, okay, let's go and do another test. So I then went and did the MEG scan. The MEG scan showed out of the 68 points of functionality in my brain, 42 were damaged. So, which then, in the particular 4 lobes of the brain, we then did a brain map and worked out, well, okay, there was damage in all the particular parts, which meant then they would manifest themselves in physical and behavioural problems, all which then rang true. So I then went back to Chris Rowe and I said, I don't think your testing regime is fit for purpose. We need to have a multimodality test that is different to what you're now currently doing.
So what tests would have young Brayshaw gone and had for it to be determined that he retired? Would it been that test?
What they do is they drive you into a volumetric test to see what the blood flow is through your brain, and the theory is that if they find slow parts of the transition of the blood through the brain, then that obviously means is that there is some damage or you've got scarring. So what happens is that the neuron in the brain are supported by glial cells. Once the glial cells die off, which is through trauma, they create what's called gliosis, which is this micro shearing and micro scarring of the brain, which slows down the processing.
Do you know the specifics around Angus Brayshaw and why he retired? No? Do you, Wayne?
No, well, as far as I know, and I don't believe what I read. You know that. certainly in a newspaper, that's for certain. But no, I don't. I assume he's gone and had tests. I'm interested and fascinated by the scarring issue, because when we do a shoulder or a knee or a calf or a hammy, and we know that scarring, or even we go in and do weights, we make the blood. That's how you end up with bigger muscles. It's actually scarring that just keeps growing and growing and growing, and that's how you end up with big biceps. And is that the same with the brain? So once that scars, does that continue to grow on top of one another? That it doesn't go away unless, I guess, you go in and cut it out.
Well, this is the problem. Is that glial scars then tend to create the buildup of the tau protein, which is like this thing that then starts to rot your brain. The worst case that I've got at the moment is a guy who's got frontal lobal damage, both left and right, where his frontal lobe of his brain has atrophied almost completely. His brain now looks like a dehydrated tomato.
Did he play AFL or VFL football?
Yeah, he played over 100 games. And
Are you at liberty to say his name?
no. The medical records that were kept during that period showed he had 2 or 3 clinical concussions, no idea the number of subclinical concussions. And this is why I've been pushing for a passport. If you don't have a concussion passport, you cannot have a concussion management system. The AFL know this because, from the 1950s, there was a seminal paper prepared by Thorndike. Thorndike said that in his study that if you have 3 clinical concussions, you should consider whether you should continue playing or put yourself at risk of a further one. Because in 2008, I read another paper by an American called Gudowitz, who said that every concussion after the 3rd has a 5 times impact on your long-term problems with your brain. So, we're sitting here today and we allow people, to continue to get concussed post-3, I think is a complete dereliction of duty. I think that if somebody, finished up committing suicide from, the impact of TES, which is the living form of CTE, because we can't actually tell CTE till you're dead. So it's called traumatic encephalopathy syndrome, which presents with all of the outcomes of what we find to the guys who have actually got CTE. My view is that if we can then do the correlation with that and the duty of care of the employer, which is the AFL and the clubs, well, it could possibly lead to the first case of industrial manslaughter.
What about helmets? Because that's the big topic at the moment, and we look at junior sports, and there are some clubs, and I know in Queensland and New South Wales there's some rugby clubs that all the kids, it's mandatory now to wear helmets, and it's coming in. What's your theory on them? Do they do it? Does a helmet help in any way concussion?
No, it's a complete waste of time. All it does is stop you getting a head cut. What the problem with concussion, it's about the transfer of the energy from one part of your body to the other. So when you collide, you create a G-force that's got to find a home somewhere, and it goes to the softest part of your body, which is your brain. So you have this shaking of your brain, which creates micro shears, which then create micro traumas.
And it'd be fair to say that, and as you said before, with your neck and that shock, it's not just a direct head knock that causes this. It can be a hard body knock. It could be hit in the back. It could be anything that jars your brain to shake within the fluid that it sits in.
Well, look, all of the research that I've looked at, the biggest study was done in Sweden, where they looked at 1.5 million people from birth to age 45. What they found is that in kids, there was a natural neuroplasticity where the brain tended to heal itself up until about the age 15. From 15 through to 24 was a window of vulnerability where the brain then really started to suffer if it had a clinical concussion. What it found is that if you had a clinical concussion post 15, you were 6 times more likely to commit a violent crime, 6 times more likely to be on social security, 6 times more likely to be in jail, and 6 times more likely to not live your life expectancy. So it's frightening. These are real world stats.
Wayne, it could be argued that Peter is probably one of the most powerful voices on CTE and concussion in Australian sport, and I wouldn't probably doubt in some aspects of the rest of the world. Peter, is the AFL scared of you?
Look, without a doubt is that it may not be scared of me. I think it's a pathological hate. The fact is that when you turn the spotlight on darkness and you seek the truth, this is when you find out, where the real, problems are. And, my life work is turning the spotlight in the areas of dark and the cover-ups. I mean, if you look at this as, my dad was a war veteran, right? Now, he had shocking post-traumatic stress. He also had structural damage to his brain, which we didn't realise. And it created a whole range of subsets. So what we're seeing now is because the game has got harder, faster, more brutal, we're almost creating something like the brain traumas that we saw post-war, where we had all these guys who had what was classified as, the horrors. We're now seeing this. It is a pandemic in our society. The problem with these is that, there is no workers' compensation for the players in professional sport. The AFL has decided that it's a societal problem. It won't deal with it. It just then sends all the damaged players out after they've come off the list out into, the public health system. I mean, that in itself is a multi-billion-dollar cost, and this is coming from an organisation that is a charity. This, the AFL doesn't pay tax, right? Has no corporate, responsibility. For me, sooner or later, we just have to get them. I mean, no better demonstrated than you've got 100 guys who have been certified as being brain damaged, trying to get proper, compensation from them. So what they do, they come in with this, situation, and the defence, one of their defences is the players should have known. It was their responsibility to know. And this is 20 years of denial, 20 years where the AFL are saying, there's nothing to see here. There's no long-term damage. Yet, what happens, it all finishes up as the player's fault. I mean, that's a stunning indictment of the management. I mean, in 2019, I wrote to Richard Goyder, and I said to him, I'm seeing...
AFL Commission Chairman.
The AFL Commission Chairman. I said, you need to revisit the science and medicine of Professor Paul McCrory. It is a danger to your current, past and future generations. If you don't do something now, we will then continue the same brain damage that we're getting now. And I wrote to him and he didn't respond, and good grace, I said to him, well, maybe you're busy. But, this isn't going to go away, and I'm not going to go away. You need to respond to this. And he still hasn't, and neither has the AFL.
And let's be clear, Peter, you and I have spoken numerous times about this. You love the game of the AFL.
I want to make it safe.
Yeah,
that's it,
and that's all you want. You don't want this game to go anywhere. You just want players and kids and everyone to be safe within the game that you love.
Yes.
And that's what you're about. Because I think in a lot of ways you are misrepresented, and people think, if this all comes out, then the game's ruined, and rugby league and, all of the games, and we see what's happened in the NFL and the class action. So, this isn't just a problem, even soccer with the heading of the ball. So there's all sorts of sports that this includes, and it's not about trying to finish a sport up or end a sport. It's just trying to make everyone safer. And not only safer, but for that, make the game better.
Correct. I mean, look, what we have is a very easy target, and of which I'm a very big target for people to say, oh, he's going to wreck the game. But what I want to do is make it safe so the next generation and the generation after it can play the game with the full knowledge that it's safe, and that they're not going to have brain traumas, that they're not going to have the consequence. I mean, you've seen in your teammates, some of the guys that had lots of concussions, such as Sean Smith and others. I mean, Sean basically was initially part of the long-term scanning program from the AFL, and he received a letter back from the AFL to say that there was nothing for him to worry about. I then did, the other tests, and it came back that he had 11 lesions on his brain. He knows, and we know that he's got some very significant problems, and we're able to get a good compensation payment for him. But I mean, his life's ruined. I mean, he's in the prime of his life, and he's got no quality of life. It's terrible.
Is the Players Association doing enough?
The Players Association and I are perennially at war. Do they do enough? No. Do they look after their past players? No. Look, fundamentally, it's got to change. I went to the AFL in 2021 and said we need to have a concussion fund that needs to be administered separately from the AFLPA, because anybody who's dealt with the PA knows it's now turned into a slow bureaucracy. It's very, very hard to deal with. I mean, I've had times when I've got phone calls from guys, wives saying he's on his way to commit suicide. What do we do?
What, players' wives?
Yeah, and I say, well, we need to get the CAT scan or the CAT team involved. We need to do this, and then you ring, their helpline, and there's nobody at the end of the helpline.
Well, it is a case with the Players Association, and I've had conversations with, Tim Harrington, a former teammate, works at the Players Association, Paul Marsh, and this is not just about concussion, but it's about a lot of different things. And clearly, if there's a player that's played, and there's a blanket rule for everyone, unfortunately, and that's where I think the Players Association can improve a lot, right? And that is, they do have a fund there for past players, and they do, and there is money there that goes to players for whether it be like myself, shoulder or knee or ankle or head trauma, or you've got to see it's like whatever it may be, but it's one hat fits all. And unfortunately, if a player's played 250 games and a player's played one, the compensation from the Players Association is exactly the same. Now, that clearly doesn't make sense. A player that's played 250 games is probably going to have a few more issues later in life than a player that's played one. So that is an area that clearly needs to be looked at without doubt. And
does that upset you?
Well, I've only really thought about it late, and I've spoken to you about this, Peter, of late, because things. And I knew these things were going to come. It also comes with age, even if and it doesn't matter whether you play local sport. It's all the same thing. The AFL just is the one that I guess is the spokesperson or the moral voice on, it seems, everything at this point in time. But yet we still don't. I still don't think they, and this is the Players Association, understand that the support that those who have played for a longer period of time need more help than those that didn't, clearly.
Yeah, I think, look, my dealings with them has been the full spectrum. In some parts it's been good, and in some parts it's been bad, and in some parts it's been very bad. I mean, what I said to them is this, don't beat me to death with rules. Rules are simply guides. I mean, what you've got to do is look at each case on its merit, and if a particular person needs this help, and if you don't have enough funds for it, you go to the AFL and say, well, okay, this is it. If they had have done that, we wouldn't have a class action, because they would have been, the advocates for the players and say, well, hang on, we've got this, 100 odd. I mean, it's a tip of the iceberg. I mean,
it hasn't always been a strong union, though, has it? I mean,
doesn't the AFL fund 3/4 of it?
If you go back in time, though, it's probably been mid-90s, and I think it was when. I remember Ricky Nixon. I think Andrew Demetrio was then the boss, but it then started. But it started to become. I mean, what I mean by a strong union, that all the players were involved. All of them signed up and said, "Okay, we're a part of this." And the reason why is because what they got sold was, "We're going to look after you."
Well, look, a little bit of history, right? Peter Allen was the secretary. He did it voluntarily, and he was shut out by the AFL. I went to the AFL with Graham Allen, who then was working at Collingwood, and I said to them, is it, you need to actually turn this around and fund it in a proper way. I also worked for Justin Madden, who was one of the presidents, and Justin and I collaborated on creating it into a union, right, distinct from a association. So we met with some lawyers from Cause and we developed this to turn it into a union with a federal reach, which meant from the AFL's point of view, once it became a national union, then it would mandate all of the requirements of a normal corporate outcome. So that means they would have then had to have workers' compensation, would have had to have superannuation, would have had to have long service leave, would have had to have 4 weeks annual leave, all of these sort of things, sick pay, etc., etc. So what the AFL did to cut that off, they then went and came back to us and said, well, we'll fund this. So the initial funding was between $1.5 to $2 million a year, which turned it around, and then that's when they were able to source it and staff it on a proper basis. So that's a reality. It's probably not been written in the history of the AFLPA because it's an inconvenient truth. But behind the scenes, we did an enormous amount of work to turn it around.
Well, that being said, what are they being paid today? Doesn't the AFL something in excess of $10 million annually?
No, it's a lot more than that in the different baskets. But it's really what my view is. Once you're paid by a master, you can't serve two masters, and so what it means is the independence and the advocacy starts to lose its touch because They should be at the forefront of getting proper insurance. There should be workers' compensation. There's no reason why there shouldn't be workers' compensation. If we had workers' compensation, there would be no need for this class action. For me, the class action is an aberration in our sport. We're about looking after our. We are told by the AFL that it is at the forefront of everything they do is the welfare of players. Well, then. Clearly they've failed if you've got 100 of your champions, and these include Brownlow medalists, club champions, best and fairest.
Premiership players.
And premiership players knocking on the door of the court saying, you fucked us over. Really, and, the AFL, from my point of view, is this, we just need to have a clean out. We need to get people that actually understand what is happening to these past players. The commission, they may as well have their meetings in Mongolia or Siberia. They're so far removed from the actual source of what actually goes on here.
You summed that up succinctly and perfectly for me because it's only been in recent times since I've been involved with a company by the name of the GBS, Good Bloke Society, and they do a lot of things around men's health. There are a lot of ex-AFL players that are involved in it, and I love the camaraderie, I love the business connection, but more importantly, I love the support that they give for one another. And through that organisation, and we've actually had Shawnee Wallace on this show before, but the reason why I love it is because of the confidence that people have to bring up certain things that are going on. And just to back up what you said then about players, I've had players in recent times and the things that they've rang and called me about, and it is about how they're feeling, and they don't want to be here anymore, and it is heartbreaking. It is sad. At different times they've reached out. Clearly, well, not at different times. A lot of times they've reached out to the AFL and the AFLPA and stuff, and they have been given some support, but the support stops. It stops. It doesn't go any further, as I said, because there's a restriction on how much support one can give. And some of the answers that I've had back when I've delved into it a little bit deeper have been, Tony, that, well, we can't, you can lead a horse to water, but that's as far as we can take it. So it just gets cut off at that point. And when one's time to, sort of looking themselves in the mirror and helping themselves, and it's a lot more serious than that. And when you receive those calls, and I know how passionate you are, and like I said, it's only been recently that, it's actually becoming weekly, and yeah. I've all of a sudden, become someone that these guys are ringing me, and I know they ring Sean, and I know they ring other people. Clearly, you get phone calls, but it just sits with you, and it's heartbreaking. I'm no perfect person. I've had my own issues. I've got and who knows, but it's that burden that sits with you, and the heartbreak that you hear, like you said, and it's not. It goes wider. It's not just it is the wife, the partner, the the girlfriend and the kids and all of those people that are going through this, the mums and dads, the brothers, the sisters. They're the ones that have to receive the call when this sort of stuff happens. So it is there's just a long way to go. And that's why we're sitting here now having this conversation, and that's why the more I think we talk about it, Pete, the more we hope that it improves and there's improvements that are made, because it is becoming more prevalent, and it's not the easy way out. And that's the other thing I just want to say here too, as an ex-has-been. That's all I am, an ex-has-been footballer. But this isn't people that just want handouts. And, and I think that's an easy throwaway line for people to say, oh, well, his career's over or whatever. He just wants, he just wants to be looked after and get a handout here or a handout there. That's not the case. These people that have joined the class action and ring the AFL Players Association regularly, daily, weekly, and hound them for help are not just there because they want a handout. They're doing it because they're in dire need of help. And I think that's the message that we're trying to get across here. And any way that we can make that better is obviously what we're all about. And I love your honesty, and I love the way and your passion and your drive to continue to drive this and be a spokesperson and be unpopular with certain organisations and people for it. But I have kudos to you for being that and doing that, because it is a serious issue, and it's just, I mean, the net just goes so far and so wide. Like, when's it going to stop? And it's the concussion. It's just, there's just a range of different things. It's the players that leave the game and really have just focused on everything into the game and not gone out, and they don't have trades and all of this sort of stuff. And I know that they're doing courses these days, but it's an ongoing issue that needs to be addressed and just needs to be talked about more.
Are you part of it, Duck? Have you ever been concussed on the field or thought about reaching out to Peter in other avenues about the CTE or potentially CTE or TES?
No, I've never reached out to Peter about that. I'd love there to be a test. I'd be more than happy to volunteer to go and get that particular test to see whether there is anything there. I think that anyone that's played a long length of a contact sport, whether it be boxing, whether it be kung fu or soccer or whatever it may be, rugby league, rugby union, if you've played, why not go and get the test? Because I think once, if you could find out, if there was, then all of a sudden you can start addressing different things. And then once again, you don't get these issues. But the aid, there's a lot of different aids out there in terms of diagnosing concussion within a game. And there's all these different tests, Pete, and we've spoken a lot about a lot of these tests, and we know that a lot of them are rhubarb, and they're just a load of crap, and players can trick their way through them, and they do, and players, let's be honest, players are a danger to themselves. I can put my hand up and say that you would run through a brick wall. And you could be knocked out, you could be concussed, but you go back on because it's a sign of bravery, and we see it often. We see it often. So they do have to be protected by themselves. But there are aids to determine whether you have concussion, and they're continuing to improve. And I just hope that the AFL don't just shut off to exploring all the options that they have in this area. And if there's 20 out there, if there's 30, if there's 40, if there's 50, well, guess what? Let's just get out there and try to help solve this massive issue in a sport that we all love.
Look, I think one of the things we've got to recognise that CTE is an industrial disease. It's created by your workplace, right? So the longer that you're involved in the sport, the more likely you are. So what manifests itself initially is called chronic neuropathological impairments, which is the precursor to when you then move into CTE. CTE can only be determined post-mortem, but as I said before, there's a new syndrome called TES, which is, tells you that you're likely to be in that spectrum. But you're spot on, Wayne, in terms of the reach that we need to have is that, the AFL needs to stop being this ivory tower. It needs to embrace the real world. It is a problem to keep saying, that it's not, and really is, I think, a long-term problem for them. But it's an insult to the players as well. If you look at James Hardy, they denied, but finally the science and medicine said, yes, you are creating mesothelioma from asbestos. And they all then were made to be accountable. And I wrote to our friends at ASICS and said that our chairman and the commissioners were in breach of Section 181 of the Corporations Act because they failed their duty of care on the same basis as the James Thingo case. And the response that I got back from the ASIC is that we don't have enough people to do a proper investigation. And I'm thinking, my goodness.
Peter, Wayne's probably one of the most high-profile sportsmen we've ever seen in this country, and he's often written about and spoken about.
You don't have to be that complimentary. This is
Wayne. I'm talking to Peter.
Well, he's getting paid, so
yeah.
Peter,
so he's slapping on the mayo.
Do you think Wayne has displayed any type of symptoms in his post-football career?
Basically, what happens is guys who are damaged live in what we call the new normal. So what they think is normal isn't. So the only people who we know that can then tell who are the first people to cite, the differences of the family and friends. So if the family and friends see that there is, behavioural changes, then that is a recognition that, the person that they once were before they were clobbered is different. And this is what we find, is that the family and friends are the first people to see the signs.
Wayne, Jess hasn't called Peter?
No, but my sister and everyone else probably, they'll be on the phone to you next week. But no, it's not we're being a little facetious now, but it is once again, Peter, thank you very much for coming in.
Just one more before he goes, Wayne. Peter, just for everybody listening, is there a timeline, a court date? What can we look forward to?
Well, for the class action, it's March is the next round when they will settle it. But look, as I said before, we shouldn't be in court. The AFL needs to put its big pants on and go and talk to these people. They're talking about doing a longitudinal study, right, for 10 years. You've got 100 guys who are damaged, who are sitting there in front of them. Why aren't they then going to each of those players and saying, tell us your experience? And then once we know your experience, develop a whole subset of circumstances that then we can then put into practice as a prevention modality, right, and a mitigation strategy, instead of just throwing them to the wolves and they've all got to go to court and relive the trauma that they've had in their past. It's just, for me, it's a shocking indictment on the management of the AFL.
All right, well, thanks very much, Peter. And watch your space. Like I said, I hope that I hope that the changes that are made, and I know the commentary around everything that's going on at the moment, and it's clearly shifting, but it clearly hasn't shifted enough and quick enough. But thanks for coming on The Truth Hurts.
It's a pleasure, Wayne.